Well, thanks you so much. I write for the Wall Street Journal editorial page on healthcare, biotech, and the pharmaceutical industry, and got interested in this field of bioelectronic medicine several years ago through Kevin Tracy and the amazing story about Kelly Owens. And here today we're going to talk about how to build the ecosystem to promote and help this innovative technology succeed. And maybe I just want to start with you, Scott. If you could provide just some perspective on how government policy can help promote this innovation. What can CMS or FDA do?
Yeah, look, and thanks for having me here today, and thanks for moderating this. I think FDA has been trying to lean forward in this space. We had been working on a guidance back when I was there on biological, physiological closed-loop systems. I think they finalized that in 2023, so a long time horizon to getting final guidance in place at the agency. But this was sort of an emerging area when I was at FDA. There were products in early development. I think we've really seen it explode more recently with brain-computer interfaces and other kinds of tools, the things that SetPoint and other companies are doing. SetPoint was a company that my venture capital firm invested in early. Josh Mackauer is here, who led the investment for NEA. I think has continued to support the company. So I think it holds tremendous promise. It does present some regulatory challenges for FDA. I think the biggest challenges go beyond the hardware. I think FDA has been historically pretty adept at evaluating hardware. For example, the issues around the brain-computer interfaces, how those devices get implanted, the durability, what the long-term potential risks are, making sure that has structural integrity. So, the FDA went through a period back in the early 2000s, I was there, where we had challenges with the cardiovascular indwelling devices, things like electrical probes that were put into the heart, where the engineering just wasn't sufficient to ensure the long-term success of those tools. And so I think the FDA has gotten much more adept at assessing the physical components of these kinds of devices, and certainly has a lot of experience with vagal nerve stimulations and hardware like that. I think where the bigger challenge is going to be is on the software side, where if you think about something like a BCI, a brain-computer interface, a lot of the innovation is going to be not within just the hardware itself, but the interface, the tools, the software, the AI devices that are being used to do the interpretive analysis and help direct the energy into the brain to yield the clinical outcome that you're seeking. And the challenge for the agency is that the regulatory paradigm is one of approving products that have a sort of, the development timeline has a defined start and a defined finish. And when you're thinking about software tools that enable some of these devices, they're more dynamic. They need to be constantly upgraded over time. They're learning systems. They're going to learn not just on the sort of collected experience in the software and the data that they're trained on, but also on the patient's data. You want tools that can adapt to the unique characteristics of patients. I think that's what's ultimately going to make them perform very well. And the agency, the regulatory paradigm doesn't accommodate that well. The tools that the agency is forced to work with because of the legal structure that it has, the sort of 510K PMA process, didn't contemplate this. That statute was written back in the 1970s when no one envisioned the kinds of technologies that would be available today. So I think it requires a different approach to regulation. We had rolled out, when I was there, a program called Pre-Cert. They wanted to call it Pre-Check. I objected because I thought it would infringe on TSA's trademark. I also thought people don't really like TSA, and I didn't think it would work real well. So we called it Pre-Cert, and what it was a firm-based approach to regulation, where we said basically, if you demonstrate that you do really good validation with your software tools, you can come to market with iterative changes and sort of real-time adaptations without having to come into the agency and file a new supplement or generate data that you have to report to your own file in case the agency audits you downstream. And it worked well. We ended up piloting it. We tried to get it enshrined in legislation in the VALID Act, narrowly conceived just to apply to diagnostics, but with the vision that we would roll it out to these kinds of technologies. That legislation ultimately didn't pass. I think eventually it will pass. I think it's a very important piece of legislation for this field. People look at it and they think that it's a diagnostics bill. It was never envisioned just as a diagnostics bill because it got this paradigm in place. And just to sort of put a final point on it, and then I'll pause. The concept for the firm-based approach to regulation really came up when Apple approached the agency seeking the first approval for their Apple Watch. And so that was when I was at the agency. And a lot of people didn't think we'd be able to approve the Apple Watch as a health device because they figured FDA would do what it always does, which is rip apart the watch and try to figure out the hardware, and it would be hopelessly complex, and we just wouldn't be able to figure out how to get it approved and get out of our own way, if you will. And what happened was when Apple came into the agency to show us the validation work they had done, I mean, I'm not sure how they did it. They probably put like 10,000 Apple employees on treadmills in the basement of Apple headquarters and had this exquisite validation work that they had done correlating the cardiovascular features of individuals with the performance of the device. And we said to ourselves, why are we looking at the device? Why don't we just focus on the validation and their ability to continue to do that validation as they come to market with new adaptations to the hardware? And we basically approved it on the premise of this firm-based approach to regulation. And instead of regulating the device, we'll regulate the firm and regulate their ability to do good validation, and then they can come to market with iterative changes. And so that's how the concept was first formed. And I think it's ultimately the paradigm that we're going to need to adopt within this context.
Just to follow up on that, are there other things that the FDA could do to expedite or accelerate these trials? We know like China wants to get basically every kind of innovative technology that we have, and there's a little bit of a race. Is there things like steps that you could think could be fast-tracked so these products could be brought to market faster? Yeah,
I think a lot of the challenge right now on both the drug and the device side, and it's a little bit more acute on the drug side and a little bit easier to see this on the drug side because it's playing out in real time in the venture community and the early biotech community, is just getting into clinical trials at the outset. The level of sort of preclinical toxicology work that the agency requires on the drug side or preclinical testing in animal models on the device side is pretty exhaustive, very expensive. And what the Chinese have allowed companies to do is to get into initial clinical studies earlier, often through investigator-sponsored studies at centers that have a lot of expertise doing these things, where they trust the center to have a strong IRB in place and do good validation work and make sure they have appropriate guardrails in place to protect patients. So you allow a little bit more of a decentralized early clinical development. It also allows, I think, innovators who have come out of academic institutions to advance products a little bit further, capture more of the value from those products before they end up licensing them to a larger company. So this could be sort of a good revenue stream and a good source of capital for academic centers that want to take their products further down the innovation chain, the value creation chain, if you will. That's been a big impediment. I mean, on the drug side, it's very obvious that the toxicology team is out of sync with the clinical review teams very often and is keeping companies in, sometimes years-long animal studies. And so what companies are doing are taking the trials to China and Australia where they can get into these early investigator-sponsored studies more quickly, iterate their products, get some early human data, and then bring that data back to the US. I still think the US is going to be the place where you want to do the large with the PMA trials, the large phase 3 clinical studies to demonstrate safety and effectiveness to try to bring a product to the market. I still think we're best in class. I think it's a competitive advantage getting the certainty that we get around products before they come to market. But for the early development, we are being outcompeted, and I think that there's a lot FDA can do to reform that. It hasn't been a focus of FDA right now, but I think if you wanted to sort of fashion a deliberate campaign to try to make us more competitive with China, that's where I would look first.
Jennifer, maybe you could discuss the complementary nature of bioelectronics and biologics. Do you see some kind of crossover investment in the drug companies getting into this space and maybe buying up some of these startups?
We're actually in a really unusual position in this space, and I think just for background, Tivik started 2016. I had product in market in 3 years. We had a consumer health focus, so went straight to the consumer, and since that time, over 50,000 people have pulled out their credit card and bought a product from us. So we've been commercial, and we got it done in 3 years thanks to the support of the FDA. They were actually incredibly helpful at helping us design the right clinical trials and get things through. We started a program in vagus nerve stimulation, work being done here at the Feinstein Institute on a non-invasive approach. Some very powerful results were seen initially, but I had to take a look at it and say, boy, okay, I can't bet the entire company on whether the whole industry is going to move in the right direction. Be ready to embrace something non-invasive on the timeline. So we're a public company, took the company public in 21. Also wouldn't necessarily recommend that for anyone, but there was no private capital at that point in time. So we're a public company, and I was able to in-license a biologic. So now as an immunotherapeutic company, I now have both a biologic and a bioelectronic portfolio. Absolutely, I see complementarity. I mean, when we start to look at mechanisms of action, at the moment, the two things are developed in different areas. One was developed for acute radiation syndrome. The vagus nerve work is at the phase where we'll start targeting now the initial indications. So anybody who's interested, I'd love to talk partnering around the vagus nerve work. But as I'm looking at the basic mechanisms of action that have been coming forward in the past few years around the bioelectronic, there's absolutely complementarity. I mean, ways that I'm looking right now at an oncology opportunity that with the drug we have, we can wake up the immune system, actually get it more activated, and then a complementary partner that can fire up the cancer cells, unmask them, and potentially be able to use the drug candidates to more effectively target the cells. I mean, I see those kinds of intersection points across this field growing as more and more is understood about the mechanisms.
How do you build the teams? Get oncologists or other, rheumatologists, trained in this field?
Well, we're very early stages in this. So I licensed this in February. I won't say to have all the answers. But one of the things we took as a philosophy as a company is we need to start with the patient-centric approach. The person that has come in, gotten a diagnosis, and unfortunately so you heard some of these complex diagnoses that cover multiple spectrums or multiple specialists, they're looking for a solution. They don't really care if it's a pill or a device. I mean, by and large, it's not the defining attribute for the patient. So then there's the question of how do we get the road to the patient? How do we actually make that connection point happen? How do we educate? And I do actually think that by leading with a biologic that gets us into an office, I will probably have a more receptive audience base with the practitioners. So in terms of building the team, a lot of work can be outsourced now. We're very heavily dependent on outsourced providers, on outsourced manufacturing. We don't have to be the specialist in how to do every step of the business process anymore. And that allows us to take a little bit more agnostic approach to the therapeutic side. And I am going to give one shameless plug for a company that's here hiding in the back. Anybody that's asking how to diagnose RA or figure out what's going to respond to it, there's a super cool company called InMedix that you should pay attention to. He's back there. I have no affiliation, but I'd love to.
Maybe, John, you could discuss how the insurance payment models fit into all this, and how do you see the coverage differing from maybe traditional pharmaceuticals?
Yeah, so look, I'm a big fan of innovation, especially innovation that's not afraid to take on existing mechanisms and not give up and say we don't have enough innovation. And that's why we're living in a golden age of biomedical innovation, and yet we're trying to pay for it with yesterday's reimbursement system. And all too often, that system, especially in pharmaceuticals, looks like an arbitrage opportunity. More than half of what we call drug spending in this country is actually being extracted to fund other priorities and other profits. So the health economist in me really agrees with what I heard Scott say on the last panel. We're talking to payers, we're building good models, we're looking at the cost offset so we can say, hey, this is what it costs and this is the potential for savings. And yet in my career, I've met with people in the pharmaceutical industry who've said, I have tried to launch the best drug in its class at the lowest cost, and nobody wanted it because they were making more money on the difference between the list price and the net price of the medicine today. So that's a real fear for me, thinking about launching new technology into a payer environment that has become increasingly reliant on arbitrage. And I think what that has the potential to look like is you build great cost offsets for a product like this, and you price it at a certain place, and whether or not you're able to get that price, in working with the payer becomes a real challenge when you start to think about the medical benefit, the pharmacy benefit, et cetera. And it's not just payers. I'm reluctant to bring this up with so many Northwell name badges in the room, but at every nonprofit hospital is a pharmacy department who is generating significant 340B revenue off of the 12 medicines in this class. That some of the technology that we're talking about today has the potential to replace. So again, from a straight line, this is disruptive innovation. It has the potential to replace a lifetime of pharmaceutical costs, and this is what those cost offsets look like. Is a great approach, and I think how that approach plays across a reimbursement system that is increasingly rife with perverse incentives is certainly a challenge that everyone needs to be thinking about.
Maybe both you and Scott could discuss the role of CMS, Medicare, Medicaid coverage. They've often been resistant to covering some breakthrough technologies, especially in the device space. And how do you bring them on board?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a challenge because the pathway to getting a medical device covered at CMS isn't always clear if there's no predicate device that you can piggyback on the existing codes. I think to your point, there is legislation now that would sort of secure coverage for devices that are deemed breakthrough medical devices by FDA. And we had worked, and there's legislation being sponsored. I think Senator Rounds in the Senate and Crenshaw in the House and others are sponsoring legislation that would basically compel CMS to provide coverage for breakthrough medical technologies. The issue around that, and we had grappled with this when I was at FDA because we tried to work with CMS to do this collaboratively through regulatory change, was that CMS was reluctant to cede their decision-making capacity to FDA. So effectively, what would have happened is FDA deemed a medical device to be a breakthrough medical device, and CMS, under the plan that we had been discussing, and I had worked with Seema on this, who is a good friend and a partner on a lot of policy innovation, CMS would have effectively paid for the product, and they didn't want to cede their decision-making capacity, which I understood from an institutional standpoint. I had worked at CMS as well, so I understood the culture of the institution, and also, it could very well be the case that we approve a breakthrough medical technology that's very relevant to a patient population that's not relevant to the Medicare population, or they just happen to disagree with our clinical judgment in terms of what the capacity of the device is to transform medical care. So what we had tried to work out was a system where CMS would be engaged on the front end. They wouldn't be making the decision around the application of the breakthrough designation, but they would have a voice and a seat at the table. And that was attractive. We never got it over the finish line because of that institutional resistance in CMS, but I think we went a long way to starting to sand it down a little bit. So I think that there is a path here where you could create a mechanism where CMS still retains some discretion, but there's an expectation of coverage, or a requirement for coverage, at least on a limited term basis, and CMS still has some kind of role in maybe working with FDA in terms of how products get designated for breakthrough designation, or maybe a special classification where the breakthrough designation is deemed to apply to the Medicare population. So, I think the legislation could solve for some of these, but ultimately it's probably going to take legislation. I don't see that there's a real impetus right now for policymaking at a kind of regulatory level. FDA in particular hasn't been issuing a lot of regulations, implementing new policy schemes like this, and so I think a legislative solution would probably be a more expeditious way to achieve it.
Yeah, and I'd add too that policymakers, particularly at the CMS side, are less excited about creating new fee-for-service pathways and yet seem to be really interested in the potential of reducing total cost of care. So this seems like one of those opportunities to be looking to, whether it's innovation authority or other approaches, to be able to to look at reimbursement for a different type of technology as a way to decrease cost without harming quality or any of the other ways that innovation authority is defined. So I'd be thinking about this too, not just in terms of how to get a code or how to use a code, but to ultimately be able to see what opportunities may exist to test this versus usual care and demonstrate savings, especially, Scott, as you were talking about testing or the utility of this, a product like this in an earlier population. I think Medicare has yet to crack the what should we do for products used in a younger population that help people aging into Medicare cost less, and I hope that that's something that more policymakers think about.
Yeah, and you made a good point before, and it sort of plays into this. When you're sitting there at CMS, it's hard to look at cost offsets from the Part B system through the creation of a medical device, and that's really what you're talking about here, trying to create efficiencies by using a device to offset the use of a chronically administered drug. There's not a good way to do that.
E&D don't talk to each other.
Right, and you don't get credit for it at a sort of macro level, at a budget level. And so, one thing you could do in this context is do a demo, do a CMMI demo. I don't think there's been one that's contemplated this, but that would be a way to do this and capture some of the savings and demonstrate that to the agency.
With the
Similar problem in some other countries. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I was going to offer, from the device side, some years ago this was unknown territory. Now there's been a lot of decisions made. There is actually a landscape there that you can start to follow. I think we have some room to make. I don't know if it comes through the advocacy or through sessions like this, but I have a drug that I know if I get FDA clearance, I will 95% get a code. get the reimbursed, get coverage. And the economics work. But as a device, I know that from the day I start that design, I have to be thinking about it. I have to be looking at what has actually been reimbursed. Oh, it has to have this weird feature that has no purpose whatsoever in the device, but it'll help us get the right reimbursement. And I think it's because, in part because some of the records show it looks like a TENS device, so we're just going to do it. We're going to call everything a TENS device unless you can prove to us otherwise.
That's a great point, because it forces you to try to steer the development in a direction to secure the coverage rather than steering the development in the direction of what's going to achieve the most clinical benefit and be the most disruptive. Yeah.
Exactly.
And then the industry being a good steward of that code is really important. I think I've seen messages from the MACs to providers saying, hey, this code for surgical implantation is not to be used for some of the other older products that are out there. So stop upcoding the old technology and pretending it's a new technology.
What about in other countries? How do you expand this? Europe, Canada, other countries that are maybe interested but also have their budget constraints. I'll put it that way.
We got our CE clearance, but I will be honest, as a smaller company, it was just too daunting. And particularly even just looking at Canada. It's supposed to be a very easy transition, but it was going to cost us $40,000 just to get us, our quality system qualified under certain guidance. So one of the things I'll say this for the sake of innovators that are listening. One of the things I really recognized about going straight to the consumer and the consumer health tech side of things, we get a lot of requests from outside the country. We just it doesn't make economic sense to do all of the pieces that make it sort of going to market in every slice that we have to. What I learned is we carry all the regulatory overhead of a medical device. So with the consumer tech product I had, it's for sinus relief, sinus pain, pressure, congestion. It works great. Wish I had mine here because I'm getting all my allergies. We still carried, I thought I'd have a med tech margin on a consumer product cost base, and it actually flipped. It was the reverse. So we had a medical compliance, quality, regulatory, all of the same hurdles that we have to meet, and yet I'm going direct to consumer, so there's no offset, there's no payer support for it. So it's basically an out-of-pocket, and how much will they bear out of pocket? So for the people that are innovating in the room and thinking consumer is an easier path to market, let me debunk that, please, up front.
Well, we only have a couple minutes left, but what really makes you excited about this space or the future? Maybe we could do a quick round to finish.
Yeah, I mean, the technology certainly makes me excited. I'm very optimistic about the brain-computer interfaces. I think that the early data, I was skeptical at first. We had started to talk about that back in 2017 when the technology was very early. But you've seen a lot of very rapid innovation in that space, both Neuralink as well as other companies. I think the agency's been pretty receptive to it too. I think the clinical development pathways have progressed fairly efficiently, and that's why you're not hearing, if the agency wasn't behaving well, I think you'd be hearing about from Elon Musk, and you're not. And so it's, from everything I gather, the development programs are going pretty well.
For me, it's actually the science that's yet to be done. We're just barely scratching the surface. I honestly thought you guys all had this figured out before I started. But I'm a business builder. I love working at the emerging edge of science. And I mean, we've talked about a few fibers down the vagus nerve. What about every other nerve in the body? What about all the cellular responses that are going on? What about the reactions in the peripheral nervous system and what's happening at the macrophage level? I mean, we are so early in this field. So for me, the exciting part is all of the discoveries that are yet to come.
I'm also excited about the technology and the energy that was in the room last night, describing not just the innovations we know today, but the potential for the innovations tomorrow. And I think as we generate more learnings about these kinds of technology, we can begin to better understand who is a good candidate for this kind of intervention, who's a good candidate for pharmacologic intervention, how do we not have to subject someone to side effects before waiting. So that kind of evolution is going to continue to evolve and I think create more partnerships between pharmaceutical companies and technology like this. We've begun to see that in the digital therapeutic space where more and more manufacturers are interested in technology that helps patients achieve better outcomes with their therapy, without their therapy, and that work should continue. And yet I just keep coming back to, I don't want to see the perverse incentives in this reimbursement system that we have screw this all up or serve as too big as a barrier.
Well, thank you very much.